The afternoon sun bore down relentlessly, casting elongated shadows across the cracked, dusty roads of rural southern Texas. Heat waves shimmered over the asphalt, while the rhythmic cries of cicadas echoed from the depths of the trees. The only sound breaking the stillness was the low hum of Jake's electric wheelchair as it moved steadily along the worn trail bordering the woods. At 41, Jake Martin, a retired U.S. Army sergeant, had grown accustomed to silence. An explosion in Afghanistan had robbed him of the use of his legs, and a year later, he suffered another devastating loss: his wife. Seeking solitude, he had withdrawn to a secluded wooden cabin on the outskirts of civilization. Life had become uncomplicated, revolving around books, late-night radio, and the occasional phone call from his VA. Jake didn't mind the isolation. In a way, he welcomed it. People pitied him, and he could do without that. But that day, something disturbed the quiet. It was faint at first, a subtle tremor beneath the drone of insects, a soft whimper, then a desperate, ragged bark. He halted, turning his head toward the woods, brows knitting in confusion. There it was again, closer this time, a choking, rasping cry for help. His heart pounded as he pushed the joystick, guiding the wheelchair off the road. The wheels jolted over dry weeds and uneven dirt, branches scraping against his arms as he maneuvered deeper into the thicket. Concern and curiosity twisted inside him, then he saw it. A German shepherd, emaciated and trembling, lay at the base of a thick oak tree. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and a heavy rusted chain was wrapped cruelly around its neck, padlocked to a metal spike driven deep into the ground. Flies swarmed around a raw wound where the chain had eaten into its skin. The dog lifted, its head weakly as Jake approached, its dull eyes holding the faintest flicker of life. Jake's breath caught. Who would do this? He scanned the area. No house, no farm, no sign of a person. Whoever had chained this animal here had done so to forget it. He reached forward, trying to lean in, but the angle was wrong. His fingers couldn't reach the chain. Damn. He muttered, frustration mounting. Reversing sharply, he sped back toward his house as fast as the wheelchair would allow. Minutes later, he returned with a dull hunting knife in one hand and a thick wooden walking stick in the other. His hands trembled not from fear but urgency. He positioned the chair as close as possible, gripped the stick with both arms, and used it to lower himself halfway out of the seat, straining to reach the chain. The dog didn't flinch. It simply watched him with quiet acceptance, as if it had already made peace with death. Not today, Jake muttered through gritted teeth. He sawed at the rusted metal, the years of neglect and cruelty making the task agonizingly slow. Inch by inch, the chain weakened until with a sharp snap it finally broke. The dog didn't run. It simply collapsed sideways, whimpering softly. Jake reached out, resting a gentle hand on its head. "You're not dying out here. Not today." For a long moment, they stayed like that, the sun sinking lower behind them, casting golden light through the trees. Two souls, both abandoned in their own ways, had just found each other. Neither of them knew it yet, but this was the beginning of something that would change them both forever. The journey back home was quiet. Jake had laid the frail German shepherd across a thick blanket in the back of his old truck and driven slowly along the dirt road, glancing in the rearview mirror. Jake checked the mirror every few seconds. The dog barely moved, only flickering, its eyes open when the truck jolted over a dip or rattled across a rut. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had vanished, leaving behind a soft orange glow over the trees. Pulling up beside the ramp, Jake let out a slow breath, staring at the fading sky before murmuring, "We'll figure this out, you and me." Inside, he settled the dog, now as clean as he could manage, on a bed of towels near the fireplace. He didn't touch him, not yet. He understood that kind of trauma didn't vanish with a warm meal and gentle words. The first night was rough. Every time Jake moved, the dog flinched. When the heater clicked on with a soft clunk, a low growl rumbled from his throat. He refused food, turned his face away from the water bowl, and pressed himself against the wall, as if bracing for something worse. Disappear into the wall. Jake gave him space. The next morning, he rolled into the kitchen and prepared a bowl of warm broth with shredded chicken. He placed it several feet away from the dog, then leaned back in his wheelchair, sipping his coffee without making eye contact. His voice was slow, quiet. Name's Jake. Used to be a soldier. Lost more than I care to count. Ranger didn't move, but his ears twitched slightly. You remind me of someone, Jake continued. Quiet, watching everything. Hurt, but not broken. He did this every day, preparing meals, sitting nearby, speaking about nothing in particular. He talked about the weather, the books he was reading, the stray thoughts that filled his mind. In the evenings, he turned the TV on low, letting soft voices and music drift through the cabin. Ranger began eating a few bites each day. By the end of the first week, he was moving, slowly, stiffly, but no longer trying to disappear. Fiercely, his body tense, eyes wide with alarm. Jake gasped, barely able to focus, his hand trembling as he reached toward the table. The pain was unbearable, locking his muscles in a cruel vice. Ranger hesitated for only a second before leaping onto the bed. His weight pressed against Jake's side, grounding him, his warm breath hot against Jake's face. The barking stopped, replaced by a deep, urgent whine. Then, as if understanding, Ranger nudged his nose against Jake's arm, pushing it toward the nightstand. Jake gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move. His fingers brushed against the kit, knocking it closer until he finally grasped it. With the last of his strength, he pulled the cap off the auto-injector and plunged it into his thigh. The relief wasn't instant, but as the medication spread through his system, the worst of the pain began to ebb. His breathing slowed. The shaking subsided. Ranger stayed right where he was, head resting against Jake's chest, his steady weight an anchor in the storm. Jake let out a breathless chuckle, running a weak hand over the dog's matted fur. Guess I'm not the only one doing the saving, he murmured. Ranger let out a soft huff, his tail thumping lightly against the bed. From that night on, Jake never slept alone. And patience. Ranger responded instinctively, as if some part of him had always known this kind of training. It wasn't about obedience, it was about trust. Over time, their bond deepened. Morning walks became a ritual, Jake rolling along the trails while Ranger trotted beside him, ears alert, steps steady. At home, they moved in sync, understanding each other without words. Jake had thought that part of his life was over, that he'd left behind the man he used to be. But as he watched Ranger sit attentively, waiting for the next cue, he realized something. He hadn't lost everything. Some things had just been waiting to be found again. Slow progress, the setbacks, and the small victories that meant everything. He shared the nights of quiet companionship, the moments of unspoken understanding, and the way Ranger had become more than just a dog. He was family. People responded. Messages poured in from veterans, dog lovers, and strangers who simply understood what it meant to feel lost and then found again. Some shared their own stories of struggle and healing. Others just offered words of encouragement. Jake hadn't expected it, but that blog became something more than an outlet. It became a connection to a world he had thought he'd left behind. And as he sat on the porch, watching Ranger doze in the afternoon sun, he realized something else. Maybe healing wasn't about returning to the life he once had. Maybe it was about building something new. One day, one step, one shared moment at a time. Jerked awake, disoriented as the acrid scent filled his lungs. The haze in his mind cleared instantly when he saw the smoke curling upward. Ranger was already moving, barking furiously, pacing between Jake and the growing fire. Heart pounding, Jake forced his stiff limbs into action. He pushed the joystick of his wheelchair, but the fire was spreading fast. Flames licked up the wall, devouring the old wood, embers drifting into the air like angry fireflies. "Ranger, the door!" Jake commanded, voice tight with urgency. The dog spun, sprinting toward the entryway. He jumped up, slamming his paws against the large button panel. The chime rang loud and clear. Jake maneuvered quickly, wheeling toward the door as Ranger circled back to him, eyes alert, body tense. The night was a blur of adrenaline and instinct. Smoke alarms blared, neighbors rushed over, and by the time firefighters arrived, the cabin was still standing, though the living room was blackened with soot. The fire had been moments away from consuming everything. As the chaos settled, Jake sat outside, blanket draped over his shoulders, watching Ranger pace in the dim porch light. His fingers brushed against the dog's fur. "You saved my life," he murmured, voice thick with emotion. Ranger let out a deep sigh and leaned against him. Jake had rescued him once, but tonight, Ranger had returned the favor. Watching the firefighters work, his breath still uneven, his mind replaying the moment. Over and over, it had been so close, too close. Beside him, Ranger sat alert, his body tense, ears flicking at every distant sound. Jake reached over, fingers brushing against the dog's fur, grounding himself in the solid, steady presence beside him. "You did good," he murmured, voice rough. "You did real good." Ranger let out a low huff, finally settling down, though his gaze never left the house. The flames were out, the immediate danger had passed, but Jake knew things had changed. The cabin could be repaired, the damage fixed. But the trust, the unshakable bond between them, that had been forged in fire. He did something Jake hadn't expected. Instead of stepping forward, Ranger turned and pressed his head firmly against Jake's leg, his body still, unmoving. Jake swallowed hard. He had told himself this was the right thing to do, that Ranger would have a better life, more purpose, that it was the kind of opportunity he couldn't deny him. But sitting there, feeling the weight of the dog's quiet refusal, he realized something else. Ranger had already found his purpose. The handler hesitated, lowering the treat. "Sometimes they know where they belong," he said gently. Jake exhaled, running a hand over his face before letting out a soft chuckle. "Yeah," he murmured, looking down at Ranger. "I think he already made his choice." The man nodded with understanding, no argument, no push. "If you ever change your mind, the offer stands," he said, giving Ranger a final pat before stepping back into the van. Jake watched as the vehicle pulled away, then turned his wheelchair toward the house. "Guess you're stuck with me." "Huh?" he said. Ranger wagged his tail once, then trotted beside him up the ramp. Jake had thought he was giving Ranger a second chance at life, but in the end, Ranger had given him one too. Right here, beside Jake. Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He ran his fingers through Ranger's fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. No words were needed. They both understood. The world would keep spinning, and opportunities would come and go. But some bonds weren't meant to be broken. Some stories weren't about grand gestures or distant places. Sometimes the most powerful thing was simply knowing where you belonged. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the sun dip below the horizon. "Come on, buddy," he murmured, wheeling toward the door. "Let's go home." And without hesitation, Ranger followed. And a few generous donations, he started something new. A small local program dedicated to pairing abandoned dogs with veterans who needed them most. He called it Second Chances. It wasn't a big organization, not at first. Just a few volunteers, a handful of rescued dogs, and veterans willing to take a chance on healing. But as word spread, so did the impact. More dogs found homes. More veterans found purpose. Jake never saw himself as anything special, but people looked at him differently now. Not as a man bound to a wheelchair, but as someone who had turned pain into something meaningful. And through it all, Ranger stayed by his side, the silver bell on Jake's wheel always jingling softly as they moved together. One crisp autumn morning, Jake stood at the edge of the training field, watching a newly matched veteran kneel beside a nervous stray. He saw the hesitation in the soldier's hands, the uncertainty in the dog's stance. Then, slowly, carefully, the dog stepped forward, pressing its head against the man's chest. Jake smiled. He knew that feeling. "You ready, Ranger?" he asked, glancing down. Ranger wagged his tail, eyes bright. Jake nodded, pushing forward, knowing that this work, this purpose, was just the beginning. Stories in those pages, memories of war, of loss, of nights spent staring at the ceiling wondering if life had anything left to offer. But there were also stories of hope, of a dog found chained in the woods, of a fire that could have taken everything, of a decision made in the quiet of a morning to start again. Jake ran his fingers over the worn cover, then picked up his pen. There was still more to tell. As he started to write, Ranger let out a soft sigh, his tail thumping once against the porch. Jake glanced down, smiling. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured. "I know. We're not done yet." The sun dipped lower, casting golden light over the ranch. In the distance, the laughter of volunteers echoed across the fields, and a newly rescued pup barked excitedly as it met its veteran for the first time. Second chances weren't just for the dogs. They were for everyone willing to believe in them. The sun was relentless that afternoon, hanging low in the sky and casting long shadows over the cracked, dusty roads of rural southern Texas. Heat shimmered off the asphalt, and cicadas screeched from deep within the trees. The only sound louder was the quiet hum of Jake's electric wheelchair as it rolled slowly along the worn trail by the woods. Jake Martin, 41, a retired U.S. Army sergeant, had learned to live with silence after the explosion in Afghanistan that took the use of his legs and the loss of his wife just a year later. Seeking solitude, he had retreated to a wooden cabin at the edge of nowhere. Life was simple now. Books, late-night radio, and the occasional call from his VA counselor. He didn't mind the isolation. In some strange way, he preferred it. Pity from others was something he could do without. But that day, something broke the silence. At first it was faint, a tremble of sound beneath the buzz of insects, a soft whimper, then a desperate, ragged bark. Jake stopped. He turned his head toward the woods, his brows knitting in confusion. There it was again, closer now, a choking, rasping cry for help. He pushed the joystick, guiding his wheelchair off the road. The wheels bumped over dry weeds and uneven dirt. Branches scratched his arms as he maneuvered deeper into the thicket, his heart pounding with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Then he saw it. A German shepherd, emaciated, filthy, and trembling, lay at the base of a thick oak tree. Its fur was matted with dirt and blood, and a heavy rusted chain wrapped cruelly around its neck, padlocked to a thick metal spike driven into the ground. Flies buzzed around a raw wound where the chain had rubbed the skin raw. The dog lifted, its head weakly as Jake approached, its eyes dull but still holding the tiniest flicker of life. Jake's breath caught in his throat. "Who did this to you?" he muttered, scanning the woods. No houses, no farms, no people. Whoever had chained this animal here had done so to forget it. Jake leaned forward, trying to reach the chain, but the angle was wrong. His fingers couldn't grasp it. Frustration burned in his chest. He reversed the chair, turned sharply, and sped back toward his house as fast as the wheels would allow. Minutes later, he returned with a dull hunting knife and a thick wooden walking stick he kept in the closet, just in case. His hands trembled, not from fear but from urgency. He positioned the chair as close as possible, gripped the stick with both arms, and used it to lower himself halfway out of the seat, straining to reach the chain. The dog didn't flinch. It simply watched him with quiet acceptance, as if it had already made peace with death. "Not today," Jake muttered through gritted teeth. He sawed at the chain link. It wasn't easy. Years of rust and cruel intent had made sure of that. But inch by inch, the metal gave way. Finally, with a sharp snap, the link broke. The dog didn't run. Instead, it collapsed sideways, whimpering softly. Jake reached out and placed a hand gently on its head. "You're not dying out here. Not today." He stayed like that for a while, his hand resting on the dog's skull, the sun sliding lower, behind them, casting golden light through the trees. Two souls, both abandoned in their own ways, had just found each other. And neither of them knew it yet. But this was the beginning of something that would change both of their lives forever.